Esteemed speakers, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and a very warm welcome to this annual conference hosted by the Small Business Standards. This year the edition is entitled, How Can Standards Support SMEs to Benefit from the Data Economy? Now, this is the first online edition, and it's an event in 3 parts, packed with eloquent speakers from around Europe who will join me to unpack some seriously compelling issues, and particularly to focus on how standards can help remove the barriers that prevent the small players, the SMEs, from exploiting the full potential of the data economy, and sometimes from being able to trade at all. So that's the key issue on the table, super wide-ranging. We've got some good time to have a look into all of the corners of the topic. My name is Katrina Sichel. I'm a broadcaster and a moderator, and I'm actually based in a physical studio in Brussels. And the majority of my speakers, in fact, all bar 2, one is beside me at the moment. I'm not sure you'll see him unless we have a wide shot, but the majority of my speakers are joining online. But right at the end, and it's very critical that you stay, we will have SBS Director Maitane Olebaria, who will join me with some rousing closing words and some very, very useful information. So stay with us. You can tweet at any time during the conference. The hashtag is, of course, Standards for SMEs. So any eloquent words of wisdom, anything you'd like to share, please do get busy. It's very important. And you can also join the group on LinkedIn. So what can we expect today? I said that this was an event in 3 parts. Indeed it is. We will have an opening session, and then we're going to have 2 approximately 1-hour-long panel debates, which will be split by a very, very short break. You can't go away, you can't grab a coffee, because there's a brilliant little video clip that we'd like you to see between them. The one important thing to say to you, we are talking about all things digital and standards within them, and we want you to interact digitally. You will see Slido embedded below the screen. You can ask questions of the speakers in panel 1 or panel 2, but I probably won't pose them until about 3/4 of the way into the session. So we will curate those questions and we'll take the most popular ones and the most pertinent ones to pose to our speakers who you will meet as we go along. So I think that's everything from me. I'd now like to get the party rolling with our opening session, but I'd like you to know who those speakers in the opening session are. Let's have a look. So, what better way to kick things off than from a message from the President of Small Business Standards. She has recorded something specially for you. So give a very warm welcome from the comfort of your homes and offices to Gunilla Almgren. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, as President of Small Business Standards, I'm delighted to welcome you to this year's SBS Annual event. As you most certainly know, this year's event is dedicated to the data economy and how standards can help small and medium-sized companies to fully benefit from it. Back in 2017, The Economist published an article titled "The World's Most Valuable Resource is no longer oil, but data." This might ring a bell with you. There is no doubt that data is increasingly becoming a critical factor of production, whichever industry you work in. Let's take my own sector as an example. As you may know, I'm an entrepreneur in the field of sanitary fittings. Admittedly, the idea of technology in the bathroom may seem a little counterintuitive. However, there are already multiple examples of how smart bathroom fittings, showers and toilets can collect data and help to monitor people's health, save water, or allow the elderly and people with disabilities to live more independent lives. In view of this, it's clear that accessing, sharing, and reusing data offers tremendous potential for the creation of innovative products and services. According to different estimates, the European data economy will reach between 500 and 700 billion euros this year, which is equivalent to between 3 and 4% of Europe's overall GDP. In the digital economy, whoever controls access to data has a greater ability to innovate and bring new products and services onto the market. 5 of 6 largest firms in the world today, Alphabet, Amazon, Apple, Facebook, and Microsoft, are major players in the data economy with a combined market value of nearly $5 trillion in 2019. These corporations, along with many others in the data economy, collect, store, analyze, trade, and sell data. Their data wealth gives them immense market power, allowing them to dictate the terms and conditions of data availability and use, and capture enormous economic gains. This often creates entry barriers for innovative SMEs and startups. Small and medium-sized enterprises represent over 99% of all EU businesses. They are present in every sector of the economy and are the key to ensuring economic growth, innovation, and job creation in Europe. Nevertheless, when it comes to accessing data, SMEs often face difficulties or exclusion. As a result, they cannot always take full advantage of the opportunities brought by the data economy. Our challenge today is to find a way of making the data economy work for all, small and big. In this context, both regulations and standards play an important role. Regarding regulations, it's crucial that policymakers provide the foundations for fair data access conditions to ensure efficient use of data across different sectors in the EU. The EU has already undertaken some action in this area, and I'm sure Mr. Nunes de Almeida and Dr. Schultes will enlighten us further on this aspect today. As for standards, it's important to make access to data technical possible at a minimized cost while ensuring the security and privacy issues are properly addressed. SMEs need open standards and that guarantee quality of data, appropriate security, interoperability, and equitable access. The challenge here is to ensure that standards are written with SMEs in mind. This is where SBS comes in. SBS is striving to increase the involvement of SMEs in standards development and working for SMEs' needs to be better taken into account. In this context, our role is to make sure that standards providing the technical foundations of the data economy are SME compatible. This is a precondition for a fair and competitive data economy. Today's event offers a valuable opportunity to discuss the challenges that SMEs face in relation to the data economy. We have brought together highly qualified and knowledgeable speakers and panelists. With them, we will discuss not only the challenges, but also the opportunities of the data economy and the role of standards in this area. Without further ado, let's begin our discussions. Thank you very much for joining us online today for what will undoubtedly be an interesting and informative event.
So thank you very much to the president of SBS there. And what was very helpful is that she just identified some of those areas that we will be discussing this afternoon. She talked about the necessity for open standards, interoperability. Oh my goodness, I once wrote an animated clip for the commission on that, and I used to go home weeping. It was that complicated for me. So interoperability, we looked at entry barriers. So all of those issues are going to come up. I just want to say, before moving on to our other two opening speakers, I think what was helpful there was how she applied that to her own specific sector. And sometimes when one comes from outside this area, you forget what data actually applies to and where it can be helpful. And of course, where the EU is focusing all of that to address some of the big societal challenges. So things like clean mobility, those environmental challenges, where it can be useful in the domain of healthcare, personalised services, and of course, to shape policy making. So I think it's important to just bring it into the everyday, because after all, it is for the average citizen and consumer. So that's got some of the ground. We've covered some of the ground there. I have two lovely gentlemen who are joining me in the rest of this opening session. We have about 18 minutes together. You'll see I'm very precise with the clock. So joining us online from the European Commission, Gunilla just mentioned him, we have Joaquim Nunes de Almeida. He is Director, Goods, in the Single Market and Enforcement, and that's interesting, enforcement, because I know that's something in the digital strategy that the Commission has been talking about, enforcing existing rules. He's from DG Grow. And joining me here, which is lovely that I'm not alone, I have Dr. Norbert Schultes. He is head of the Economic Department, the permanent representation of Germany in Brussels, and it's brilliant, obviously, to have somebody who can talk from the perspective of the German presidency. That's critical. So, as I said, we have 18 minutes to chat together. I've got three questions for you both, so you need to do the maths. What am I going to ask you? Be super concise, please. Less is more. I'm going to start with an opening question for both of you. I'm now going to look at you directly, so the audience might see my eye line shift a little bit, because I'd like to see Mr. de Almeida. Earlier this year, the Commission adopted a new industrial strategy. Could you just talk about the main elements of the strategy and which of them... I beg your pardon, new data strategy, and which of these elements are particularly relevant to SMEs? Because we heard there that they are the most vulnerable and often not in strong positions in terms of negotiation, nor costs, nor expertise.
Well, in the context of the industrial strategy and its follow-up, Commissioner Breton has been, and in particular in the light of the recent COVID crisis, of establishing a series of ecosystems to see, a definition of 14 ecosystems, from things ranging from tourism to automotive to raw materials. And I think that from an SME perspective, which is not my area, what I think is that SMEs should try and find ways of joining whatever consortia, associations or alliances that are being built, often by big business, and that they associate themselves to that effort. Also, in the light of the fact that the Commission is very much focused on some degree of strategic autonomy and some resilience for Europe, so that SMEs find a role in all of that.
Okay, and my obvious question, because, you sit as the moderator on both sides of this, so you're saying, the SMEs, they need to align. We've got these different areas, these 14 ecosystems. Do you think that the Commission is conscious enough of creating enough mechanisms for SMEs to have their voice heard?
Well, I can speak for my area in particular. I mean, on standardization, which is very much the over-encompassing subject of today, we do make sure that SMEs are represented in the process. They are part of the so-called Annex 3 societal type of organizations that are participating in the standardization process. And we're always very keen on finding ways to make sure that the corner startup with 3 or 4 people has as much say as big business. This is not easy, but we're always interested in finding ways where we can make this more of a reality.
Okay, thank you very much. And sorry, indeed, we were talking about the industrial strategy there. You sort of have these brain freezes as a moderator. Sometimes you're going, why is that on the page? So thank you for giving us a little bit, very concise top lines there. I'm going to turn to you, Dr. Schultes. You're welcome to talk to me if you want to be mindful of our audience down this camera here, that I'm looking as you see fit. Now, the obvious question here is, one of the main focus points in the German presidency is, of course, recovery from COVID-19. And my God, there are so many challenges in that recovery. So can we see that digital transformation within that will still remain a priority? And can it actually help with the other kinds of recovery?
Okay, but please let me first give my thanks to Small Business Standards for inviting me to this conference, and that we are actually sitting here in this virtual conference actually very much underlines the need to prepare for digital transformation. And this is also the experience with our presidency, because we are faced with a challenge that a lot of our council meetings are held in a virtual format. Yeah. And this also very much affects our working. Yes, you are right to overcome the COVID-19 pandemic and to recover from the economic crisis all over Europe. This is our first job to tackle. And but we also feel that the issues which have been of importance before the crisis, which is the ecological transformation and the digital transformation, we are now very much knocking at our doors. Then for us it's quite apparent that we can only deal with the crisis in a joint European approach, and because we also see it that the pandemic and its economic consequences do not stop at borders. So it goes also with all of our support that the money of a European recovery plan should go to a large extent into the digital transformation. And the COVID-19 pandemic also very much revealed the need to develop innovative digital tools, and but it should be also clear that when we are developing and applying those tools, that they have to be based on the existing data protection framework, and that applies not only to data protection but also to the protection of electronic communication and health protection as well. And in this context, we actually want to expand and strengthen the digital sovereignty in Europe, and we will discuss those issues at the informal meeting of the Ministers for Digital Affairs on the 15th of October. We will there have a discussion mainly on digital sovereignty. So please, at that stage, let me summarize our
you can see my hand signals.
three main points. Yeah. First, we want to strengthen the digital sovereignty of the European Union. We want to strengthen the European platform and data economy. And the last point, we want to work on a so-called legal framework for human-centered digital transformation. These are our top priorities during our presidency in the digital field.
Thank you. Thank you for your clarity there, and I'm glad to hear the last one, this legal framework for human-centered approach, because having moderated around AI and such like, this is absolutely critical at the moment, and I'm sure that's something that our speakers will address. Let me come to you, because now I am coming to the digital strategy, not the industrial one. You said that your specialization is standardization. So let me ask you, what are the main elements of that strategy that was published in February, and when do you think it will be adopted?
Me.
I am indeed. I'm presuming you can see me look at you with very beady eyes.
No. But it's always different. So the standardization strategy, we're planning it for end of this year, beginning of the next, would would focus more on policy than on process. So it would focus primarily to see how can the standardization community, the industry, the private sector, the standardization organizations like SBS, how could they contribute to achieving the goals of the twinning strategy? Twinning strategy meaning the focalization on greening and digitalization. So that's going to be one. Second, also, how can they contribute to the resilience of the European Union? And that brings us into the geopolitical context and also so therefore, on the one hand, green, digital. On the other hand, I mean, how can Europe position itself in the geopolitical competition for standards to safeguard better its interests in the new world trade context? Also, and then to define what needs to be achieved to reach such goals. In particular, what can we do to streamline and perfect and improve the standardization making process to make it more agile, faster, and more efficient?
Okay. I think that's the word there, isn't it? Because that is sometimes the difficulty, isn't it, with the development of standards and this development of proprietary standards and the difficulties for fast movers. So are you optimistic that it can be more agile? You use that word there.
Well, there's always a price to be paid. I mean, you can either be very transparent or very inclusive or very efficient, and there's a bit of truth in that. But I think we have to strive to get a bit the best of both worlds. I mean, we all agree that the standards making is taking too long. Both from our point, I mean, the Commission is probably too slow. The private sector is probably too slow. Everybody is a bit too slow, and I think that we have to become a bit more focalized and quick.
You need to become the Usain Bolt in terms of speed. Is that what? One quick, and I'm very aware of timing, gentlemen. It's my fault, because just another question. You're in a pub with somebody who knows nothing about this, and you talk about and picking you up on resilience. You said there, what's important in that strategy? What do you expect in terms of the focus on policy rather than process? And you talked of contributing to Europe's resilience. In one sentence, I know nothing. I'm sitting with you in a pub. What does that mean?
Where can Europe not be dependent on others?
Okay.
In short.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So, Dr. Schultes, I'm going to stay with me because I have another question for you, sir. Thank you. Let's look at the global dimension, because that's very, very important. We just looked at I asked the question about Europe and resilience. When does it not become dependent? In fact, we just heard from Mr. Nunes that we want to help, we're calling upon SMEs and all companies to help shape Europe's position in the world. So how can Europe shape the events in the fields of the new technologies, such as AI? Because, of course, that is one of the most important applications of the data economy.
Okay, so maybe the best thing would be if we take the one who's puzzling us at the moment most. It's fighting against COVID-19, and this here we can clearly find the potential of AI because we can in fighting COVID-19 there's a potential in the rapid sharing and use and the analysis of data, and it will will help in finding vaccine faster, and it will improve diagnostics and therapy. So this is very much, I do see very much hope in AI for the faster detection of, and also for the faster detection of new pandemics and outbreaks. So this is, I would say, one thing, and this is also where Europe could then give a contribution on a worldwide scale, and we are also in this area. We are very much looking forward. We are now speaking with a Commission also to the planned legal framework for AI. Okay. We expect it for early next year, but I can tell you that in the Council we are already very much working on the AI white book, but we are very much looking forward to the framework provided hopefully early next year by the Commission.
Okay, I feel like everything in the last year or two has been hopefully then, because of a series of different circumstances, from Brexit to COVID to everything in between. One question before I come back to you, please, Mr. de Almeida, which is just on AI, do you think, just you personally, as the German presidency, that this approach, which seems to be a risk-based approach that we just heard from the Commission in terms of AI, really this testing, monitoring, this ex ante, this, we need to look at those high-risk sectors. Do you think that's the right way to go?
Yes, I think that's the right way, but before I mentioned the term human-centered. Yeah. So this is very much a crucial issue to find the right balance between the potential of AI, but also taking care of our own values, not to spoil the basic European idea of data protection. I think this is quite important to find here the right way forward here.
Thank you. I have a question for you in a moment. I have a last question to the gentleman who is joining us from the Commission online. So I am coming back to you now, sir. You've moved. I love that. You have such authority. You're sitting in various parts of your room. Now you have a beautiful picture.
And you noticed it. You see, yeah.
I did notice it. So obviously we are looking at the role of standards. That's absolutely critical. So, I mean, easy question. In which 3 ways for you, the most important ways that standards are vital for Europe's data economy?
Well, I think that a bit like my colleague from the German presidency has just said, I think that for the data economy, the important thing is that we garner support in view of making sure that the future data economy will be from data protection safe, will be safe from a cybersecurity point of view. So I think that it's bringing very much this idea of values and human centricity to the debate. I think that I would say that's the bigger challenge for standardization in the data economy.
And do you think, when we heard there from the beginning from the president of SBS about these barriers to access, do you think that standards are critical in terms of helping eliminate those barriers to access to data and creating a more fair, level playing field?
Definitely to create a more level playing field, but we also want to make sure that the level playing field is respectful of human rights and data protection. You see, so yes, I mean, standards have proven in the last 30, 40 years of internal market to be a cornerstone of making the market work. And Europe has this specificity that once you have a European standard, all national standards are set aside, and there's just one standard for the whole market. So this has been quite important for the functioning of the European economy. But I think on data, the particular challenge would be to bring this aspect of values, human rights, data protection into this level, that it is built into this level playing field.
Okay, thank you. I'm scribbling there because I may put this to our further speakers, but that's built in by design. Okay, thank you very much for that. And I just ask you to stay with us while I just come to Dr. Schultes at the 11th hour. I'm being very strict with timing. What do you see as the role for standardization in the data economy?
Well, I see it very much in the same way, like the colleague from the Commission. We got in the field of goods, in the field of services, we got a very much established system of standardization, and now it's up to us to apply this well-founded system to the data area. And where, of course, this is a bit more complex because the requirements are specific, but we have to face the challenge. It's even, if I might mention one example also in the cloud business. There's the German-French project Gaia X, which will be also expanded on a European level, where it's even more complicated to find common standards. But this is the challenge we have to face with a data strategy by the European Commission. But I can tell you, we are also in the German context, we are working on a German national data strategy to tackle all the issues arising with standardization in the data economy.
Okay, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to both of you. Thank you, and also I really appreciate, and my eyes are going between the audience and between you, sir, on screen, our colleague from the European Commission, and to you, Dr. Schultes. I really do thank you for being so concise, because you've set the bar very high for your peers to follow. So thank you very much. You are allowed to take your leave. You may go wherever you like now. You do not have to sit in front of your picture.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So that's provided us with a lot of useful content, some context for what's to come. And we're going to start to put the meat on the bones of the issue in our first panel. So I'm just going to let Dr. Schultes know that as far as I'm concerned, I think you can take your leave. I am sure you don't want to sit with me for the next 2.25 hours saying nothing, so you are welcome to go. And I'm going to invite our first panelists to join me very, very shortly. And, oh, there they are. Are they ready there? I don't think they're there yet. No. I'm going to talk a little. I'm seeing them backstage. It's all very technical wizardry here. I'm seeing them backstage at the moment. But this first panel is going to put the meat on the bones of the issue of how standards can contribute to a fair access to data. That's our focus. So we're going to look at, obviously, the opportunities, but the obstacles, all of this, the opportunities, the challenges to accessing data, the real current difficulties that are faced by SMEs and in different sectors that could be addressed with the help of standards, and the importance of standards in ensuring fair access to data, and also the kind of data format standards and API standards needed to ensure interoperability. So there's a lot of things. What do we need to keep in mind when developing a standard on data economy and ensuring data accessibility? So those are just some of the topics to unpack. I'm obviously not the expert, our speakers are, but who are these speakers? Let's find out. So, a very, very warm welcome to my lovely ladies and gentlemen joining us online. Hello, I love it. Isn't it great to be so nosy, to look at people's backgrounds? You see, Sylvia is giving nothing away. You see, there's nothing behind her, whereas who do we have? Of course, the professor is looking like a professor with all his books. Well, that makes sense. I thank you very, very much to all of you for joining me on what is actually a sunny afternoon. It was horribly rainy. We've got an hour together. And I have to leave time for audience questions. So I know I've terrorised you into being concise. Please be as concise as those two opening gentlemen were. It's very, very important. I'm not going to do long bios. They're online. If people didn't read them, it's their fault. I love that. The professor says, no, for God's sake, don't do that, because mine is so long. Okay, so Professor Jakob Bates, you can wave again if you like. You come from RWTH University of Aachen, and your research interests focus on the facilitation of building information modelling with open standards. In fact, you're co-founder of the open source model server platform, bimserver.org, amongst many other brilliant achievements. So, literally, from both your perspective and, of course, learned experience, what do you think are the main challenges regarding digitalisation, but specifically data access for SMEs in here, the construction sector? Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Good afternoon, everyone. So to answer this question, really, let me give you a brief introduction into the particular challenges of the construction sector, where we have across Europe approximately 5 million jobs organized in companies, 97% of which are smaller than 10 people per business unit, per business. So we're really dealing with, or we're really facing with a very small number of people scattered in very heterogeneous companies and involved in intricate value chains, and at the same time creating approximately a third of all the energy that we're spending in Europe. We're spending in a built environment. We're dealing with fractured projects where 50 to 70 different trades, levels of expertise, engineering disciplines come together and have to organize themselves around really complicated value chains, and producing things that, of course, especially in Europe, they last for hundreds of years if everything is working out well. Mm-hmm. So coming together, standards and particularly standards for the interoperability between all the different trades is really, really crucial. So the parts of the challenges really is that bringing together all these complex kinds of information that need to be communicated during construction projects, but also in their maintenance and the operation, in the management of the facilities, is really outstanding in this very fractured landscape of all the actors partaking in the building industry. So one of these aspects really is how do we ensure for small businesses especially to heighten what we call data literacy, mm-hmm. so to enable and empower people mm-hmm. to really be able to deal with data in the first place. Mm-hmm. How do we access make the access and ownership of data fair and transparent? And maybe as one of the last challenges that we're facing is, especially in Europe, is that nearly 80% of what we're doing in the already built environment. Mm-hmm. So we're dealing with very dirty data, and we need to have a better understanding of what we're dealing in the first place. So that's a short or hopefully concise answer.
That's a concise answer. And let me remind our lovely audience that, of course, you can input questions at any point. I won't look at them until a bit later in the session, but we're only going to pick the super short ones. Say to whom your question or comment is addressed, and if you want to say who you are to, you're absolutely welcome, but Morse code length. Thank you for that. Just a very quick, if I am one of your students, how do you explain in 2 sentences interoperability?
It's the ability to have technical devices, communicate on your behalf with your business partners to make the exchange of information work on behalf of all the actors that are involved in the processes that we're dealing with.
Yeah. And complicated, across devices, across sectors, about portability. That's why you probably weren't online when I I had to write a clip for the Commission on that. I wept every night because
I can understand your weeping.
It's not simple. Okay, I will come back to you, sir. It's quite interesting to hear from another sector now and ask the same question. So I'd like to invite Sylvia to answer that same question. Sylvia Godson is the Chief Executive Officer of FIGIEFA, which is the International Federation and political representative of the independent wholesalers and resellers of retailers of automotive replacement parts. And she also coordinates the Secretariat of the Alliance for the Freedom of Car Repair in the EU. So it's this same goal to have access to repair and maintenance information and in-vehicle data. That really is a big focus. So we're going to look at the automotive sector. And I ask you really, I turn to you now, my eyes are flitting a bit for the audience between the camera to them and to you, ladies and gentlemen on screen. But what are the main challenges for SMEs in the automotive sector, both in terms of digitalization and accessing data? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, many thanks. I hope you can hear me well.
I can.
Yes. Indeed. FIGIEFA is part of the automotive aftermarket, and this is a digital ecosystem which indeed employs 4.5 million people in over 500,000 SME companies. And this is very much to emphasize, because this is a sector which is often the most unknown sector of the automotive industry, but we are the other part of the industry who is responsible for keeping cars on the road, enabling personal mobility, distribution of goods and services, public transport of nowadays 300 million vehicles on the road. And indeed, apart from repairing the vehicles, the question of access to the vehicle data is extremely important for us. Now we are connecting with a plug-in through an onboard device, the onboard diagnostic connector. So it's not that this access to vehicle data is alien to us, but what is the novum of digitalization and the new challenges for us? Now with the new connected cars and their embedded telematics, there's now the new possibility to allow for digital remote services. So nobody wants any longer a breakdown, but nowadays there is the technical facility in vehicles to predict faults, to monitor remotely the vehicle, and to interact directly with the driver. And this is absolutely crucial for us to, and the entire mobility sector, the possibility of having access to these possibilities determines whether yes or no, all services around the connected car will be yes or no competitive, whether there is innovation, yes or no, or whether indeed the CCRM will be competitive, yes or no. Okay. So this is the setting. Having said that, where's the problem? We have the particular problem, and today I would like to, especially in my contributions, highlight also the role and interplay which I see in between the European Commission and the European or other standardization setting bodies, because we have a number of experience here. But this is indeed the core feature. Standardization can be as good as it's a technical emanation from a legal basis which the European legislator must set. And this is for me a very important message. If there are two companies who are in principle prepared to share data, that's fine. But what do you do if there are dominant market players who indeed monopolize data also by technical design? Okay. And this is our case.
I need to ask you to slightly
in our
condense.
case,
don't worry, I will come back to you, but yes.
Yes, and in our case, the problem is that indeed car manufacturers have created closed telematic systems where they are now the gatekeepers, and they decide arbitrarily who has access or not to the in-vehicle car data. Okay. And this must be addressed by regulation.
Thank you, thank you. And I just to say, before I move on, and just to sort of get everybody's opening salvo, just want to say that important word. It's also about the user, isn't it? It's not just because we're talking obviously also about the aftermarket. You said it's not really known sector. You don't really think about that. But we're also talking about the consumer having choice. That's also the importance, isn't it, with this data aspect?
Of course, when we said competition, innovation, ultimately that's not a goal in itself. That's all to foster, at the end of the day, consumer choice and, of course, the wider data economy. But if you don't create the prerequisites for allowing these companies to offer services as a first place, then there is no consumer choice.
Yep, thank you. And also, as I myself said at the outset, but also as I had read in the position paper from SME United, then there are some businesses that will simply go to the wall. They just simply cannot compete. But I will come back to you. I love that. You're in bright red with a white background. It's like, don't mess with me. I love it. So thank you. I will come back to you. I'm going to pass on to Niklas Kunert. So hello to you. You may wave if you like. Hello to you. He is manager for standardization and projects Mittelstand 4.0 Kompetenzzentrum e-Standards. His passion for standards, well, I've said it goes back to the early 2000s. That doesn't make you too old, Nicholas, I think. And it increased when you were working for the REWE Group IT department in the German food retail sector. So you're now a supply chain consultant for GS1 Germany, and you're responsible for standardization in a funded project that focuses on SMEs and how to best support them through digitalization by using standards. So we're going to focus in here on the textile sector because you've got some experience in the textile sector. Where did you find the main challenges for the SMEs in this particular area?
Yes, thank you for having me, and greetings from cold and rainy Cologne today.
Cologne.
Yes.
I love Cologne.
Oh, that's nice.
I really love Cologne.
So we are close connected to some projects in the textile sector right now. And what we can see, some of these companies are already pretty far concerning digitalization. But what you can see, the former projects of digitalization, the focus of these projects were mainly the efficiency and the costs of projects. And so the factor interoperability was not a factor. And that leads to the point that these companies act like small islands without any connections to other companies or customers or suppliers, for example. Yes, and right now there are many requirements from customer side to have data access in the cleaning process of textiles, for example. And they cannot solve this problem because they don't use standards for identification or for capturing these data.
And so if you could wave your wand, to get a change overnight, I'd spoken, the gentleman from the Commission who joined us, he talked about agile, getting greater agility in standardisation, in bringing those standards forward. So what would you think, what would be the biggest help? If you could wave a magic wand there, what would you want for those SMEs?
Yes, we all know standardization is a very slow process, and it works with a certain critical number of companies who work with the standard. And our aim should be, and we work together with the Textile Service Association, of course, to set a standard for this sector. So they have this the safety for their investments in software and hardware, so that the standards go to the sector more fast.
Okay, thank you, and also thank you again, because you did bring up costs and you twice actually in your answers, and I think that's also one of those critical elements. It's the cost. Yes. It's not a level playing field for everybody at all, and often prohibitive for SMEs.
Standards are not always in the cheaper and the faster variant.
But also, I was in terms of accessing data, and in terms there are cost implications along the board, and often that there isn't a level playing field between the SMEs and the bigger players. Thank you. I will come back to you. I'm going to move on to the ETSI chairman, Enrico Scarone. I'd love to have a quick chat with him. He was heavily involved in the foundation of ETSI TC-M2M and a major influencer for the creation of 1M2M, developing a global multi-service system for IoT communications. Do you know, Enrico, if you had me on your team, you would just, oh my God, you would just throw your hands up in the air and say, go home within the first hour, Katrina. But hello, how lovely. You are a boffin in ICT. How can standards assure a fair and equal? Fair and equal are the words we've heard even from the professor at the beginning, access to data.
Thank you, Katrina, for the introduction. Just a clarification, I'm not chairman of ETSI, I'm chairman of TC, not M2M in ETSI.
So I was wrongly informed, or else your bio is wrongly put online.
No, the whole ETSI is
my apologies.
Maybe one time I can do it, but not now.
Not now. Okay. So I beg your pardon. So standards, what's their role? Fair and equal access to data.
Yeah, the important thing here is to try to answer to the typical question that happened, because standard deals with technical specifications. So that's the means in which the communication and exchange of information happens in the case of it, which is dealing communication for IoT. Basically, there are a lot of technical terms behind that, which are protocol interfaces, API, providing the security, providing qualified access control in order to implement policies for privacy, provide additional information on the data, when I can assess what I can do with the data in a framework. Sometimes we focalize too much on the specific protocol or the specific solution. That's not the challenge. It is a cost that must be solved by sure, but that's the easier part. The complicated part is that in a world of IoT, where my definition of IoT is when different parties from different sectors are able to share information, not only the data, but the information contained in the data, is that you have to put everything inside a framework. And that's exactly what is my current activities, and is the current activity of ETSI, is that the standardization of this framework, which provides all the, let me say, for the telecom guys that are working on networks, the obvious part, what they say, protocol interfaces, security mechanisms, all these kind of things, management of devices, which maybe are not obvious for other sectors, but for the people working on network and communication is the obvious part. But also the additional part. When you are talking about IoT, you have really to take into account, and was also said before, that there is a lot of legacies and a lot of solutions. And here is the challenge, to put the solution inside a single communication and interworking framework. And not only to share the data, we focalize too much on access to the data. It's not enough. You have to access to the information inside the data. You have to understand the information. It doesn't mean that you have the analysis of the information, but at least the information itself must be understood. And that's the other part, is what we call the semantic interoperability, which is one part of the standards which is running on top of the communication part. So basically, the standard for IoT should be a communication framework with semantic interoperability, which is able to go across the diversity. And now I right to the point. This has been done. It's been done mainly from the ICT telco guys, but simply because they face the problem of interoperability much well in advance respect to the industrial world. For ETSI, for 1 and 2M, in general, for all this world, standard means interoperability. Okay. There is no difference between the things. Okay. And even you see the approach, in ETSI, all the specifications are freely available. You can download it. Freely, contrary of other situation where even just to access to the specification, you have to pay something.
I need you to come to a final close soon.
I'm going. I'm very close to the final one. No problem.
I can see questions coming in, you see, from audience, so I need to leave time. So please conclude.
What is important is that, and I go to the closure, is that you can choose what to do. You can change provider, you can change provider of devices, you can change provider solution, and de facto, especially for SMEs, it means to remove the vassalage that very often you have respect to dominant player, even if not towards dominant player, towards someone who has some general solution. Okay. Try to move money, and finish with this slogan, from platform and communication, which must be community, and try to move money on services, which should be really the competition part.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And I think that's also what Silvia also touched upon there. It is this issue of choice, and you concluded there with it. And perhaps we will speak further on that anon, but I need to turn to my last speaker, who's waited very patiently. You look very chilled up there, Malte Beer Katzenberger. I say up there, your top right, sitting back with your headphones, looking cool. Team leader, data policy and innovation at DG Connect. So we have a colleague from the European Commission. Thank you very much. You've been there for a while, since 2011, I think. And you're team leader in a unit responsible for horizontal questions of the data economy and data-driven innovation. So I'm going to come back to the data strategy, which is what I discussed with your colleague at the outset, and ask you what are the main challenges regarding data access and reuse that you, the Commission, are aiming to kind of tackle.
Happy to be here, and please interrupt if the sound or the video doesn't really give you what you want, but connectivity is sometimes still an issue even in digital countries. Very happy to be here. I think this data strategy reasons in principle along the line that data sharing can be voluntary. Sylvia alluded to that. And in a voluntary data sharing context, we try to reason at 3 levels in terms of standardization needs. The first one is to bring down the cost of any data sharing in any sector, because currently it's prohibitive sometimes to share, because you have to set up everything from scratch, or not everything, but very often you have to set up things from scratch. So you look for any type of standard that you need to use to maybe encode permissions. And we would like to bring those costs down. And that's the whole idea behind the idea of creating common European data spaces, which is a more an abstract concept, but basically saying if we have a governance around data sharing in a sector, already that would bring down costs, and the sector should rely on generic standards. Now you wonder what these could be. Some of you may know the iShare scheme in logistics in the Netherlands. Others may know the Gaia X, which also has the International Data Spaces Association on board with a reference architecture how to communicate across any type of company or provider. And I'm learning about more frameworks existing, and we should certainly make use of those. Now, once the data space is there and has made use of a generic layer of standards which are common to solving problems common to everyone, you obviously can engage in standardizing voluntarily intra a specific ecosystem. And that could already work, and it's best done if you do it without the Commission, because the Commission is slow to put things on the rolling plan, and you better maybe want to do it without it. The final thing, which is really hard, I think also sometimes to steer, and here maybe the notion of governance of standardization also should come in, is what happens cross-sector, if still the notion of sector or domain makes sense. Now, a lot of players, large players have a conglomerate of activities in different sectors, and they're certainly helping out to edge from one sector of activity to the next one, and to build the bridges that are necessary to use data from one specific activity into the next one. And digital platforms are very, very good at that, and they all try to discover new fields of activity, be that health or insurance and finance, and they certainly can do that. But how do we tackle the situation now if we are on the other side? So people want to access basically a sectoral ecosystem, and they could be small companies. How would they actually signal that they have an interest in standardization something? So this is really the cross ecosystem standardization needs, and how do we capture those? And we would really like to make a better move out there, but knowing also that it means also a lot of participation in relevant meetings, maybe also where sometimes the crux lies. I want to make a final.
Okay, you are allowed 30
seconds
seconds for a final point, because you've exceeded your time, but go ahead. Go on. You waited patiently. Thank you.
It's a compulsory system, situation that Sylvia alluded to. And here she already said that the technical standardization should follow a legal obligation. Is that a right to access for certain players in certain ecosystems? Or is that a portability right, where in a human-centric perspective, we already spoke about that, we basically build on portability rights that already exist under the GDPR, and that would now need technical reflection, but it would meet really probably a situation-specific technical reflection. I can now port in this ecosystem my data into another standard. And we really would like to work on that. Last word, the discussion I think that we observe in the automotive sector is only a prelude to the discussions we will have on all connected objects in terms of what about the adjacent and aftermarkets, if you want. How will they be able to participate? We're having similar questions from household appliances, agriculture, and even lift servicing and repair markets. So the questions come back, and that is something we really would like to say when we speak about clarification of IoT rights in IoT data, which you found in the data strategy. That's really about questions like that. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to crack straight on, because as I said, I can see some questions come in, and I can't make minutes arise out of nowhere. So I'm going to be quite swift with you with a second lot of questions. Then I'm going to perhaps pose a couple of questions that have come in from the audience. But I think that, let me come back to you and sort of combine questions, Jakob, if I may, because obviously the construction sector, there are increased environmental requirements for the products, for the properties, for the performance. I mean, you already said why it is complex in itself with these tiny little companies, with these very intricate value chains. You've got these buildings lasting hundreds of years, and you've got these environmental requirements. So where do you think specifically data access can be helpful there in terms of those products and those properties and that performance?
So indeed, one of the really challenging things were interoperability and open standards for data and information and semantic interoperability between services that employ them in the built environment is that there's so much embodied energy and so much embodied material in our built environment. There's currently one of the European projects called Buildings as Material Banks, and you can extend this to, of course, to the infrastructure, not only to buildings but to all the publicly owned infrastructure. There's approaches that go beyond the individual building, the individual point infrastructure, by regarding our shared infrastructure, which is publicly owned in most cases by the European constituency, to regard them as systems of systems that really interoperate on all different kinds of levels, where we have to ensure that we're actually trading information, or that we're sharing information publicly, that we're able to integrate these information into new services, because they will be crucial in saving energy and in doing things like circular economies, where we would try to have imagine a building ledger for every built infrastructure piece that we have. What can we reuse? How can we harvest what is in there? And for all of that, having open data that is openly available and that can be integrated into new services is really, really crucial. And one of the big chances, one of the big opportunities that the European community has, and that the national owners have, is that so much of the built infrastructure is actually owned by the public. Yeah. So we can make demands for open standards. We can demand for long-term interoperability and semantic integration of these things.
It's the worst one to say, isn't it, interoperability? I always say, do not say it when you're drunk. But no, thank you very, very much. And clearly that call there for open data and the importance and also, as you say, there is so much that is publicly owned shared infrastructure, and that's where great gains can be made. I will come back to you, and I will probably, before I come to audience questions, perhaps give you a chance to have a tiny chat amongst yourselves, but that depends on how concise you can be in answer to my question. I know that the Commission obviously came back to you, Silva, and we're not going to get locked into any kind of, I know this is such a big topic, this access to data and vehicles, so we won't focus there, but I do want to come back to you and ask, this issue of standardisation and how in particular, to build on what you had first said, can support innovation and SMEs in your sector with this access to data. Is there something that you wanted to reply to the Commission? Is there something that you wanted to build on from your opening comments?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, many thanks again. Yeah, just to, as a quick reply, perhaps to Malte Bayer-Katzenberger, I think that data portability is not the right instrument for solving sector problems. The GDPR is protection of personal data, but it rather is a toothless tiger when it comes to having a dominant market player who, by the technical design of the Internet of the intelligent thing, here the car, rather blocks the free possibility of consumers, of course, to ultimately decide where their personal data go. So you need to have also technical prerequisites. And that is why here, we are not alone as VGFA, but basically they are saying the entire aftermarket and other mobility service providers who clearly ask for standardization, because standardization determines whether yes or no you as an SME, you can enter, you have a meaningful customer basis, you can program once and run everywhere, for example. And of course, we face now that car manufacturers have proprietary access technology, so we truly need a standardized API, a standardized interface, not only for the aftermarket, but here I'm fully with you, Katrina. I'm fully with you. It's for the wider benefit of the CCIM and of the data economy. But let me just also make a caveat. I would like to really stress from our experience, because we participated over 10 years in international standardization, CEN ISO. We have participated also at UNECE, cybersecurity regulation. I must really would like to emphasize that I personally, and our issue is today SMEs, I personally would like to convey the thesis and notion that I believe we need much more of an oversight of European Commission, an early and explicit SME check of international standards. We have made, unfortunately, the experience as an SME in international standardization bodies, I couldn't talk for all, but the ones we have experienced, that indeed big companies use their power, they bring issues into play which are not technical, which are genuinely market-driven. The systemic decision-making within international standardization bodies is that, for example, in ISO, you have national member bodies, mirror committees, you have, just to quote, Russia, Japan, who at the end of the end can co-decide about an international standards. SMEs don't have the possibility to influence these national mirror committees and bodies. Big corporations have.
I need
At
to ask
UNECE,
you to come to a conclusion. I'm so sorry.
For example, UNECE, which is the second panel, also here also. The contracting parties have a right of veto, and a lot of important competition-related issues for strengthening the entire aftermarket and wider mobility market have been downvoted at this. So I would like to conclude we need much more, with also more and more international standards being cross-referenced into European legislation. We need an explicit and early SME check and competition law compliance check of international standards before they come into European legislation.
Okay.
And that is
I need to ask you to, sorry, it's a horrible job, but if I do, I've promised the audience and then I haven't actually listened. And it's a nightmare because we always have brilliant speakers with big brains and we never have enough time, but you, the audience, know this. Thank you very much. And we clearly hear your call there for early and explicit check of international standards. You said that the big companies have much more sway in terms of bringing, the non-technical, the market-driven issues into play. So let me just move. I'm not going to come back to the Commission yet. I am going to come. There was a question. I think let me come to Niklas again, because just building on what you first said, I don't know, it might be a bit complicated for you to combine these two, because one of the things I wanted to sort of put into your head is obviously this issue that the SME is both a provider and the user, and where, standards can assist in that context. But we do have a question that's come in, indeed, because I raised this word about agility. What would you suggest to make the standardization process faster and more agile? So, and whether that be for an SME as a provider or a user.
Yes, one good solution could be to work together with the sector association, for example. In the one hand, there could be already a standard and the companies just don't know about that. And in case there is no standard by the association, for example, you can work together with the association, and then you are much stronger than the single SME. Together with your sector association. And that's what is happening right now in the textile sector.
Okay, thank you. I will come back to you in just shortly. Actually, no, sorry. I'm not being very good for the technical crew there, because they're about to bring somebody else to the fore. Let me just stay with you for a moment. I think, what we've heard thus far in terms of costs, level playing field, perhaps not always in the best negotiating position, SMEs, do they have the time, the money, the resources? So is there anything in particular that they should focus on first? You said about combining voices there at an association level, but anything that they should look at?
Yes, a first quick win could be to look on the roots of the interoperability. For example, the identification of players in the value chain, like items, like companies or anything. If there's a standard, The same for capturing methods or data transfer. And then it's good to look to your suppliers and to your customers and even to your competitors, what they are using. And so not to be the only one who's using an internal system. And of course, when they all use their internal solution, then you have to contact your association maybe to have a common standard for a sector.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm going to move directly on to come back to Enrico, if I may, who is not the ETSI chairman. That has been clearly signalled. And I'm going to combine a question, Enrico, with a question from me with a question that's come in online, which is exactly that. You mentioned that there are standards, there are existing standards, but sometimes it's just too complicated. What can we do to help SMEs? I'm just reading off my other screen here, to use these standards. And in and amongst that, perhaps, I mean, let's take the ETSI standards for smart lifts. Is that a good example, or is that tremendously complicated for SMEs?
No, it's a good example. Let me say one thing, that the key element has been already mentioned. There are three major SDOs recognized by the European Commission in Europe, which are Sensanelec and ETSI. Just look what they have done before starting your own solution. There is a big tendency to develop your own solution, sometimes because you don't do it. And very good suggestion to go to association and before, in order to be informed. You can also.
I'm losing you a little bit. Are you good and near your microphone? You're popping a little bit.
I should go, but maybe it's the internet connection.
Ah, okay. I was going to ask you to hunch closer, but I think you're okay. Go for it.
If it goes worse, tell me. So what I said is that.
Look at what's been done. Look at what's been done, you said, before you develop. Yeah.
That's exactly the major aspect. The association could help, even the standard body could help.
Yeah.
That is very open. And that's one of the roots. Of course, technical solutions are not easy. You have to assess your own ability. You have to understand if you can do it by yourself, or you have to do it as using some specialist and select the right specialist. Nothing is really so easy. But saying that, if you start to use what exists instead to try to reinvent everything, you can have very nice effects. And I come back to the example that you mentioned of smart lifts. I heard before standardization is low. Sometimes the European Commission is not going at the right speed. But even when it is fast enough, you have the things available. Even the European Commission behaved very well in anticipating the needs. You must use it if you want to take the benefit. That's exactly a key element. In ETSI, the work that I'm doing, we have this complete framework that I mentioned before. There is also a correlation with a big work sponsored by the European Commission, which is called SAREF, Smart Application Reference Ontology, which supports the semantic interoperability, and it's all integrated. When the smart lifts people comes to ETSI with a need, and smart lift equal is expressly EFESME, EFESME, which is the Association of Small and Medium Enterprises in Europe, they made some study. When they decide to start the standardization, the process can be quite quick for standardization. We receive a request in January, February, that's the period we still receive it, and we will have the standard at the end of the year. Simply because there are a lot of problems which has been already solved, including communication, interoperability, semantic interoperability, security, management of privacy. All these technical means are standardized. And you have just to plug your sector knowledge, which is very specific for you and that the standard body needs to receive from the SMEs. But with a minimum of work, and this work has been done through SBS, with SME is a member of SBS, this can be done relatively quickly. I tell you that less than 1 year for a standard like that, for a communication between elevators, platform, in a framework of elements, including communication with the final user, not only in a B2B relation, but also in a B2B2C relation, it is a short time, less than a year. But it can be done. Just reuse what is available. That is really the major message.
Thank you. And okay, and that was a little bit, you were reflecting also on what Niklas, who preceded you, had said, because he was saying, look around, identify certain elements in the value chain, look around to see what your competitors are doing. So you're saying, look around to see what exists. There is stuff there. You might need some help. You might need help from the standardisation bodies, from the associations, but look around you. So I'm going to come now again to the Commission. We've got a question for Malt, and perhaps I'll combine two. I'll just give you a moment. And then, ladies and gentlemen, what might be helpful is, because you are the experts, you're hearing from each other. If there's anything that someone has said, something that you would like to add, particularly the role of standards, something you'd like to take somebody else up on, we can have a moment on that while I wait for more questions to come in. But there's a couple of questions, of course, really to say to you, Malt, how does the Commission see the role of standards in particular in that data strategy, to just make sure that we've, dotted the I's and crossed the T's there? How are they seen? And we also have a question, hold that thought. In the European Data Strategy, there's a Data Act foreseen for next year, for 2021. Could you just give us a couple of bullet points on that, please, sir? Thank you.
No, with pleasure. I mean, it's as I said in my introductory statements, any sharing benefits from standards to make the sharing more efficient. And that's really, I think, the message of the strategy, to lower them wherever it's possible. But I think the pain points are when people don't agree, or when it's too difficult to set up a standard, or especially when people don't agree whether anyone should have access to the data. So we're looking more at, I think, from our perspective, at situations that Silvia described, where within an ecosystem there's a trouble point. Now, the data strategy said also that this specific ecosystem is going to be looked at. There's a type approval regulation for motor vehicles. We already spoke about the current in-vehicle access point. The colleagues in DG GROW will look at reforming this. There's a study ongoing, as Silvia and colleagues know. And then we will see what is a fair regime, and is that an access right that is vested in certain players, and that comes then with standards is one option. And I think the Payment Services Directive has clearly shown that, open banking has clearly shown that. It only will work when there is a compulsory set of standards that go with it and enable the rights that are laid down in the European legislation. But it will take quite some time. Now, in the Data Act, the question is, should we do more of that? And for whom? Should we and how cross-sector can we actually legislate? Because we're forced to be evidence-based, so we have to demonstrate there's a concrete failure in a given market, and that SMEs, among others, are suffering specifically. And that's sometimes very, very hard to demonstrate for us. So we need also, as Commission, much more input from the community, and we're in touch with the associations, SME United and others, Digital SME, but really to demonstrate that the market will not solve that. That's really very, very important for us. So under the Data Act, we could indeed look at the question whether there are generic problems with the connected objects in personal use, but also those in non-personal use. And we spoke about smart lifts already, and the cars, as I said before, are an example which could be in both situations. And then the question is, if there's a right for certain parties to access that data, or a right of the owner of an object to port data, would standards need to come along? And the answer is probably yes, to make this happen. And the question is, should we set the standard in the legal act? That's going to probably be not what is happening, because it's very complicated to really do this across sectors. But I would say that certain obligations can be generic and then be filled in specific instances. So people tell me that if you, let's say, want to export consumer data that online platforms have, the obligation to have a well-formed API in place is sufficiently precise at the legal level for other people to work with. Because a lot of people now are looking at platforms data as well, and hotels among others, and say we want to also be able to export that data. So it's a question, how specific will it be in the Data Act, and how much follow-on work we will have to do differently. It's really difficult, because it's at our level, doing data across all sectors, it's complicated.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much. I love it. You know, when we have this view of you looking up as though, you know, when you speak, so I can see all of your thoughts sort of almost formulating in a knowledge bubble above your head. Well, I think, I mean, what might be, if I can see everybody together again, and we only have 10 minutes, ladies and gentlemen. Oh, we do have another question for construction, which I will come to for the professor around compliance, regulatory compliance. But I mean, did anybody just, we've had a whiff of this, really want to say more about issues where we should be looking at legislation and issues where we should be looking at other initiatives than legislation? Does anybody want to put in their two penneth there? Who's that? Enrico.
Yes, just to say that I tend to divide the level in two. There is the technical means of communication where we can look at standard, we can look at, there are also standards with open source implementation, which lower the entrance barrier in the standard itself. Then there is another aspect, which is really what to do with the data, what you have to share, which is relatively a part which to a certain extent is related to regulation. Because that's a part that the standard cannot solve. The standard can solve how to do things, but not exactly what to do is something that is not part of the standardization process. It's part more of a regulator legislation framework.
Okay. Anyone else on that? I'm just looking. Anyone else who wants to wade in there? Sylvia, did you? Yeah? I'll come to you first, Sylvia. Yeah, thank you.
Pardon. Indeed, to complement, and it has been said before, still, and we don't have the perfect solution yet, but indeed, with digitalization, we must find a way of indeed making this this process of standardization more agile. Still, for example, we could imagine of having, for us, a cascade is clear, European legislation emanating from there, a mandate for standardization, and still then we could imagine of, in our sector, something like an automotive council or automotive committee, which indeed would look at the ever-changing, quickly changing environment. I repeat, we have been through, for example, ISO, CEN, and it's not yet ETSI. Perhaps we should try this with you, Enrico. But still, we need in this ever quick changing digital environment where indeed standards change, access modes change, more agile instruments. I think the discussion is starting how we can fit this into indeed still remaining under the roof of European legislation, which has to set, in my opinion, really important principles and an agile. Yeah, I repeat, in our sector, we could imagine something in our automotive council who implements and monitors, but has also a certain authority to react to technological changes, but also would monitor, and I'm back to SMEs, would also monitor if then, because the dominant market players they have so many options to hamper through the not complete application of interfaces, through pricing, etc. They have so many possibilities to still obstruct then the smooth application of the standardization and access to data, that we truly believe that an ongoing process is needed. It cannot be a one-off and then help yourself.
Okay. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We don't have an awful lot of time. So if there is, in a minute, I will come to you, certainly the gentleman from the Commission. And I do have a question for you, Professor, which I'd like to ask. And I have a question for Enrico. And then what I'd like to give you the opportunity in the last couple of minutes to say, you know, bearing in mind that what we are specifically discussing is the role of standards. That's what it is. How can standards contribute in a very specific way to a fair access to data? A kind of a closing word there, something critical that hasn't been said. Really brief, please, Malt. You wanted to come in there, my question about this balance between legislation and other initiatives. Was that what you were going to come in on?
Yeah, and could also be my closing word. I think in the data strategy, you saw the notion of the common European data space, and that's where I think the conversation that Sylvia just described could happen, so that we find a governance which is collective, which is collaborative, which is working towards open ecosystems, and where there also is a fair participation for the SMEs. But it will come also with an obligation then to invest time and resources. That's, I think, the flip side of the conversation, that you need then also the views have to be heard because they're present at the table, which requires investments as well. And this is a riddle still I don't really know how to solve. But that's why I said governance of standardization comes maybe within a data space, and then it can be also more agile. And then it could be supervised and accompanied by the European Commission, and if necessary, like in the sector that we discussed, backed up with the regulatory force. But maybe in other sectors, it will happen a bit more voluntarily. And that would be then actually a desirable outcome from our perspective.
Thank you. I'm going to come now to Jakob again, because again, we're looking at regulatory compliance, and specifically in the construction sector. What role can digital tools play to facilitate regulatory compliance?
Well, one thing again from my domain, from the built environment, is making mandatory to test automatically, that is, whether standards have been adhered. When, for example, creating contracts where contractually you're obliged to stick to certain contracts, which are automatically tested for valid data that has been handed over to the next actor in the value chain. And to make these things mandatory by law is one of the possibilities, and maybe also as a closing word, one of the things that has been touched upon here many times, also by Enrico, is to the problems, of course, with all these standards, the not invented here problem, the 10 standard that is yet another standard on top of that. One of the crucial things, especially for SMEs, is simplification. Yeah. We're not only living on islands of automation, we're also living on islands of standardization. There are so many standards that, in my trade at least, that is nearly impossible for SMEs to keep track of all of this. So in order to empower SMEs through their representation to have a fair, plain level field regarding, in opposition to bigger stakeholders with deeper pockets who can afford to be present in all these standardization activities, we really need to, I think, invest heavily in making things much more simpler than they are, much more transparent than they are, and make a better job of communicating what is there in order to also prevent reinvention, prevent obfuscation. I mean, even for simple things as office documents, we have open standards that are very complicated by design to keep. To make it harder for other people to really contribute to this. So this is also something that I think we have to keep in mind as from on a European level, from a governance level, in the interest of the smaller stakeholders of the SMEs across different businesses.
And just to say that, because again, one always sits in the middle of things as the moderator. You say there, you've got these big companies, they've got the deep pockets. You really need to make things simpler for SMEs. You really need to communicate it better. There, you heard the Commission say, what's tricky for SMEs is they have to invest time and resources to be at the table. Do you think the responsibility lies in both quarters, or do you think, actually, no, come on, it's actually, they are doing the very best that they can with, resource issues, particularly now, and really there needs to be more work done at both the EU and even the national level to help SMEs?
I think there needs to be more support in listening to SMEs on the one side, and really, giving them, incentivizing even participation in these kinds of standardization on the one side, and then on the other side, of course, having SMEs themselves and their organizations to make it easier for them to participate in these, to make the organization of these participatory acts of standardization as a society easier.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm going to, We've got a few more. We've got barely 3 minutes. So we do have a question that's sort of for everybody, which I can ask at the end. You can choose not to answer it, but literally you would have 50 seconds each, or you can say something else that's absolutely critical to close off this discussion on literally how standards themselves can contribute to a fair access to data. But just one last thing, Enrico, you've got to be speedy, because it's all about, here's the question, is this safety by design? Do you confirm that by applying the ETSI standard under preparation, it would be feasible and inbuilt in the product to avoid that any attempt to modify the safety-related data from outside the lift can be assured, because then that would be safety by design?
There are all the technical means for doing that. Then cybersecurity in general is a mean of process, not only. So the technical means are all present. Then there are some behaviors which needs something which just exceed the technical meaning. Just remember that 90%, more than 90% of the breaches in security in the last period were made on the human, not on the technological attack. So there are all the meaning, all what is technical feasible is there, respecting to all the regulations. But then it's not enough. If you want to build your cybersecurity, it needs also to define your own process and your own behavior.
Okay, thank you. One question in fact, let's just give it to you, to our friend from the Commission, and then I will give everybody else a last word. And please, ladies and gentlemen, let's do the brilliant thing of coming in on time, 40 seconds, no more. Can the model, Malt, of the Payment Directive 2 requiring banks to transfer their consumer data to other companies when required by their clients be a possible model for other sectors that outside of finance?
Oh yes, it just has to be reciprocal. That's what the banks now keep telling us. It's an asymmetric framework.
Okay.
Is that a short answer?
Yep, that's a short answer. Anybody else want to come in on that, or you've got something burning to say as a parting shot? I think it's not, again, standards can contribute to fairer access. Anything that wasn't said there. We covered so many different issues around cost, around governance, around the use of generic data, around don't try and reinvent the wheel, see what's out there, whether you need an association's help, whether you need a standardisation body's help. We talked about getting the SMEs around the table, what they need to be able to do that, and the awareness to be able to do that. We talked about data sharing, legislation, other initiatives. What else? What have we not said? Sylvia, in fact, do you mind, Sylvia? I'm so rude. I haven't heard for a little while from Nicholas. Let me give Nicholas the floor, if that's all right. Nicholas, what's your parting shot in 40 seconds?
Yes. In my opinion, a standard has to add additional value to the companies. Then you don't need to think about distribution of the standard. This will distribute itself. And that's a better way than putting a standard onto a sector by law, for example. Of course, in some sectors it's necessary and important, but the added value is the better way.
Thank you very much. The added value. Okay, and Sylvia, yes, let me come to you. Thank you.
No, I will not again expand on our sector, certainly not. I just wanted to say I truly appreciated this discussion, and because there were a lot of concrete examples how to help SMEs, and I would like to incentivize the organizer, Small Business Standards, but also the Commission, perhaps to continue this process, and that we have indeed, at the end of the day, something which would work better for SMEs.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me come to the Professor.
Just maybe reiterating that helping SMEs, helping SMEs to benefit from open standards by making sure that there's that actually they're implemented and that they're actually stick to would be something from the European Commission to.
So more of an enforcement side of things.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. And can I just ask you, have you read all the books on your shelf behind you? Truly.
So this is the study of my wife and me. So we have a fair share in this.
Okay, so if I picked any book off the shelf, turned to page 52 and said, what's the 9th line, you could possibly let me know. or she?
Probably not, because I don't have a photographic
God,
memory.
you're useless. Okay. You can go now. Goodbye. No, I kid you. Thank you very much. You've been very concise. Stay with me. Don't go away. Don't go away. Parting shot from Enrico. Where are you, please, sir? Where are you, Mr. Scarone? Yes.
It's here? Okay, good. Oh, very, very at the end is that I'd like to come back to this legislation aspect. In my view, it's correct. A standard doesn't need to be needs to be accepted by the market and used by the market. But it's also true that coming back to the discussion about big companies or some companies which have some quite protective behavior on that. Mm-hmm. So the legislation maybe should not mandate one standard, but should mandate the communication and interoperability between your solution by law. That's really the change which make the digitalization of Europe happen.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And a last question to you, Malt, which actually goes back to your colleague from the opening when I asked why 3 ways in which standards are very important within the data economy. And he said, well, they need to be based upon values, European values. They need to be human-centered. They need to look after human rights, have human rights in mind, and data protection needs to be built in. Would you echo those 3 elements? Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. And it's a bit also the conversation we had on the cars. Ultimately, it should be the consumer who should make choices, and the rights should be designed around him or her who drives a car. Yep. So it's not a shadow game on very personal data between aftermarket and car manufacturers. The human has to know what's going on, because he doesn't want to be surveyed by either his own car manufacturer nor by an aftermarket player. So you have to transit the data through the individual somewhat knowingly. That's when we speak about human-centric standards.
Thank you very much. And I can sense that you two are going to do a distanced conversation in the local pub at the end of it. Sylvia, I think you know each other from some way back. But it's such a huge issue, isn't it? It's just still there and still fomenting, and for all the right reasons. So thank you very much. Thank you to you, ladies and gentlemen, for sending in your questions. I'm looking at you now directly down the lens, because everybody gets to have a break now. I really appreciate having you 5 tremendous people with your huge brains with me and for letting me crack the whip. It's always frustrating, but you were really brilliant. So thank you very much for that. And I'm sure everybody at home echoes my feelings. And of course, now, ladies and gentlemen, you get a 5-minute break. We're 2 minutes over. You get a 5-minute break. Don't run away. Don't go too far, because there's a fabulous little clip on standards that if you know nothing about it, if you're just, I don't know, a granny from wherever, Stockport, who doesn't know what's what, this little clip can tell you exactly all about it. So please stay tuned and see you in 5 minutes and no later. Thank you very much.
Well, hello. You just made a great decision visiting me here in my little window on your screen. Yeah, but enough about me. This is about what you do. Maybe you make toys, or maybe you work in construction. Maybe you make a trendy line in personal protective equipment. Well, whatever it is, you've all got something in common. You're an SME. You may be small, you may be medium, but you are definitely an enterprise. And you make up 99% of all European companies. That's pretty important for the European economy, if you ask me. So, why am I talking to you? Resistance, performance, safety. EN 16931-1:2017. GSM, quality. ISO 9001, interoperability. I'm talking to you about standards. Standards are an important instrument for the European internal market. They contribute to innovation and promote competitiveness across a range of sectors. And that's where Small Business Standards, or SBS, comes in. We're here to represent you, to shape standards in a way most useful to you. Do you get it? Whether we like it or not, standards are everywhere. Transport, trampolines, pyrotechnics, tourism, dentistry, and a whole lot more. Standards help with safety, limiting waste, opening markets, increasing productivity, lowering costs. They can even help with regulatory compliance, although they're not always designed with SMEs in mind, and this can lead to heavy testing and resource management issues, which is why we need you to get involved, so standards can work for you and the 24 million other European SMEs. Get in touch today by visiting sbs-sme.eu.
We have decided to initiate our own standards. We decided to do this within our German Association for Earth Building.
I'm a fan of the European market, and I would say, yeah, let's keep on doing it. The only thing is that I really do believe that the European Union has to really support that, because otherwise, especially for the SMEs, it will be way too expensive.
You need references, because the major concern should be about having safe products, efficient products, and trustworthy products.
It's very important to be at a level on national level to see what's happening in the new standard, because you need to develop your product, and being a part of the standard commission, you talk with other competitors, other firms, other SMEs.
You have to have standards to make sure that what's happening there at least happens in an accurate way. We are talking especially about hygienes, and that was something that we are always fighting for hygiene standards.
You have to build education towards standards. So they have to conclude that standards might be added costs, but that it is added value as well.
We see the harmonized market, we see the chance in Europe.
There is some funding from the European Commission to help SMEs for only the cost, let's say just the cost, not the time, but only travel costs.
Welcome back, dear audience. It's lovely of you to still be with us, and if you are new, then it's even lovelier that you have joined for this second part of the SBS Annual Conference, when the full focus is on standards and in helping and ensuring SMEs to get full access to benefit absolutely fully from the data economy. So do stay with us. If you're joining us now, don't forget, and even those who've been with us from the beginning, that we do have some very useful closing words from SBS Director Maitane Olabaria, who's actually going to be joining me here as well, so I won't be alone until the very end. So we now have a second panel discussion. So if you missed the first one, well, that's a great shame, because we had a good chat from 5 very eloquent speakers that looked at how standards can contribute to a fair access to data. As before, and again, if you're new, you can pose questions for speakers. I won't look at those questions until partway through, but all you need to do is put them into Slido, which is embedded just below your screen. Super, super short, Morse code length. Somebody got away with a very long one. Design on the very last one. Keep them short, and please do say to whom your question or your comment is addressed. So we've got 4 delightful speakers in this next panel, and we're going to shift the focus, and we're going to grapple with the very, very critical issue of how we ensure cybersecurity without jeopardizing the data economy. So some regulatory initiatives might limit access to standards or to open interfaces due to the risks related to cybersecurity or to liability, and, for example, standards based on other regulations, such as cybersecurity. On the one hand, standards favour the exchange of data between the different players and the uniformity of that data, but on the other hand, they make systems more vulnerable. So how can we address this? And how can SMEs deal with cybersecurity? We already looked at the challenges, costs, resources, having a voice at the negotiating table, being outplayed by those with deep pockets. So how can standards support SMEs in addressing these cybersecurity challenges? All sorts of things we're going to look at for very eloquent gentlemen who are going to join me in just a moment. So I suppose we should find out who those gentlemen are. Thank you. So there we go. I think we're going to meet. Hello, gentlemen. I'm shifting my focus now, ladies and gentlemen, from you, the audience, to these lovely people. Look, I'm being nosy now, looking at all of your background. Yes, we have some books. Books in a cabinet there from John, but books nevertheless. Do we have 2 maps? Oh, look at that. Look at the chances of that. Lars in Sweden, and we've got Fabio. So we've got the map, gentlemen. So, okay. And you've played it very cool, Steve. You're giving nothing away there. Absolutely not. Oh, now you're just showing. Okay, that is hilarious. Fine.
Didn't want to disappoint you.
Yeah, you're being very discreet. Well, I'm going to start with you because you are head of core operations at ENISA, the EU agency for cybersecurity, and member of all sorts of steering boards and advisory committees, and the ENISA representative on the ISO SC27 working group. So you are representing ENISA in all sorts of international conferences on international security, on information security. So, I mean, the very obvious first thing to start with, of course, is this current situation we find ourselves in, COVID-19. We've made this big move to digital, not that it wasn't there, but it's forced us all to move quicker than perhaps we had anticipated. So in the context of that, how on earth can we ensure access to, but also reconcile data, privacy and cybersecurity?
Okay, it's an interesting question. I don't actually think there's anything to be reconciled in the sense that privacy, access to data and cybersecurity are all quite consistent concepts. I think it's perception that tends to mix them up. So to my mind, at least, the way in which you get correct access to data and correct privacy is through understanding, which might sound rather trivial, but it's actually not. Understanding data turns out to be quite a challenge, even for people who've been dealing with it for many years. And in cybersecurity, the security of data is context dependent. I'll give you an example of that. If I were to ask you what your favorite cuisine was, you would probably have no problem telling me if it's Hindu or Italian or whatever. If I ask you the same question before you board an aircraft, I may be socially profiling you. So there it becomes private data all of a sudden. Mm-hmm. So understanding the data is actually key to being able to enforce privacy, confidentiality, and all the other security attributes. Cybersecurity is simply the means which we use to do that. So it's the enforcement mechanism, if you like. And in cybersecurity, we talk about 3 things: confidentiality, which is similar to privacy; integrity, that the data doesn't change; and availability. And that's actually making sure the data is available to people. So the idea is not that we don't make it available, of course, it's making the right data available. And that's enshrined in Articles 5 and 32 of the GDPR. So I think if I were to make just 2 or 3 points very rapidly, the first would be, as data is being increasingly used everywhere for all kinds of decision-making in machines and in automatic environments, I think users will have to invest more time into thinking about their data and to thinking about, what data they want to let out into the big bad world and which conditions. And unfortunately, people tend to put all kinds of stuff online without many inhibitions, whereas you definitely wouldn't do that if someone were to ask you for the data on the street. So we need to develop a sort of electronic common sense, I think, in order to deal with data in the future. I think coherence is also key. So in one of my past lives, I was security officer for a very big financial institution, and we spent a fortune trying to secure data on one of the platforms, only to find out that we were going to give it away on the data warehouse. Happens a lot more than you may think. And it's hard to spot sometimes because different business units have different goals in life. And I think all these things illustrate quite a fundamental principle in cybersecurity, and that's that in cybersecurity in particular, there's a tendency to rush into the solution maybe before you fully understood the problem. And I think this is something we need to be very careful of in the future as complexity is really increasing in almost every sphere of life. And as I said, just understanding what your data is and what you want to do with it is no longer trivial.
Okay. So
again, you don't need to conflict them. They're coherent.
Sorry, say again. I interrupted you there. Beg your pardon?
No, it's okay. I was just saying that you don't need to deconflict them. They are coherent.
Okay,
you need to think very carefully about them.
Okay. And also, of course, data is information. I mean, that was very much where Enrico was he was emphasizing that. I just want to ask one question before I move on, because it's important to just sometimes give examples. In my day, you said we need to develop some electronic common sense. Users have got to think about what data and how much to put out there. I get up, you talked about social media. Presumably it's also when I visit a website and I decide, am I going to change anything there? Am I going to accept everything? Where else do I need to be aware of where I'm putting my data? Like where should I be asking those questions, Steve? You're saying, I need to be...
any electronic environment, even when you go, let's say you go to the bank or you go and sign into a building, you go to a hotel, it's amazing the kind of questions you will be asked. Some of the questions are quite fair and they're actually legally required, but not all of them. So if a hotel asks you for your name and date of birth, that's probably a legal requirement. If they start asking for your preferences for room types and locations, etc., that's not required. So that's really up to you. And quite often these things can be rather insignificant. Quite often they can be quite damaging when put together with other forms of information.
Oh, man, I bet you're fabulous to travel with. I bet nothing gets past you. I bet you're like, no, why are you asking me that? It's a bit... Okay, thank you very much. That's very clear. And a key word that I take out of that is understanding the data. Don't rush to solutions. You've got to understand. I'm going to put that same opening question now, if I may, to Lars Odlund, who is the CEO of SME Remote Quality Management, and he's a Swedish entrepreneur. With a bookcase behind him. No, he's not got a bookcase behind him, sorry, absolutely not, with a map behind him. And he worked for Cone HQ for 10 years in product development and service development, but he's actually the owner of Remote Quality Management. So it's a manufacturer of remote lift monitoring systems that fit any lift, old or new. And the company provides maintenance to, individuals, owners, companies, building managers, with information on the availability of lift, the energy consumption, the service visits, and so much more. I'm going to ask you, do you agree, because I'm going to ask you the same question with this COVID situation having pushed things to digital, would you agree that they are consistent concepts, the data, the privacy, the cybersecurity that Steve just said?
Well, I must say I'm maybe a little bit the bull in the china shop. I would say, as remarked by the chairman of the ETSI, Enrico Scarone, in the previous debate, cybersecurity is not an issue. We have ways of dealing with those. More likely, it will be an excuse for big companies to restrict data access, which is a clear disadvantage for the SMEs. So take as an example, my company who make third-party monitoring systems for elevators, which means we can deal with any manufacturer, any type. And the way to do that is to go behind all those control systems which are restricting access to the people or the devices of the manufacturer, the original manufacturer. So the fact that somebody bought an elevator, and the same thing applies to motor cars, doesn't mean that they control or allow to be access the data which those units give out.
Okay. So that's interesting. So if I get you all around a table, it'd be interesting now to ask the same question of Fabio. So hold that thought. You very clearly said you think it's used by the bigger companies to restrict access to data. Fabio Guasconi, let's meet you. You are president of the Italian standardisation body for ICT, and you are a whiz at information security and data protection. And I think where you focus, I'm sure there are many other things: risk assessment, governance. We heard a little bit about that in the first panel. Compliance management using international standards. So you heard those two responses. What would you say in terms of COVID-19 moving us more swiftly to digital, this balance, data privacy and cybersecurity? Do you see it as consistent concepts? Do you see it as being used by big companies? How would you come at this question?
Thank you very much for this opportunity to intervene. My personal opinion on that is that this trend was, well, this event, unfortunate as it is, just sped up some tendencies, some technological advances that maybe are running faster than any social advances that are out there. So it didn't really create a problem, it just did underline a little bit more the problem. I have the opportunity doing my work to interact with many enterprises, all sizes. I don't personally think that security or cybersecurity, as we want to call it, it is being used as a barrier or as an exclusive mean to put out some actors from the market, at least not consistently. Right now, there is the security level around us is, to say the least, worrisome. There are lots of products, a lot of services that are provided without any really solid security foundation. And it is not just a matter of which small, medium enterprises are responsible. There are very large enterprises of which we use services every day or products that don't take this into account. They didn't before the COVID, and they are not doing that now. So the problem is quite, in my opinion, and it is quite complex to solve it with a single. Nevertheless, I do agree that privacy and information security or cybersecurity have to go along together, and you have to find a compromise between the two.
And where do you think the focus needs to be? I mean, when you look at reconciling those, when you look at those coming in the same basket, let's say I'm an SME, where do I need to put my focus there? And how do I need to make sure that if I've got my eye on security, it's not stopping me from being able to really, fully exploit the data economy? What must I be thinking about there first? What should I be cautious about or proactive about?
First of all, understanding the problem is the first step in solving it. Most of SMEs don't even pose themselves the problem of information security or cybersecurity, or they do it much too lightly. So the first things or the first point to go with is to invest in awareness training and to make people knowledgeable about this matter. As I won't be able to choose wisely a car if I'm not informed which are the characteristics of one car between the other. I can't choose product or services, even from a buyer's perspective. If I'm an SME that has to buy some services from the outside and then to resell to other customers, if I don't know what to look for, then I will not be able to choose wisely on that.
Sure. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much for that. I heard, but that wasn't your door. It must have been here. I thought I heard your doorbell ring there, that you were going to be taken elsewhere, but I'm glad that you have not been. I will certainly come back to you, because we're going to talk about certification schemes under the Cybersecurity Act, and I would like to have your viewpoint on that. So I'm going to turn to John now, who is part of ANEC, the European Consumer Voice in Standardisation, the ANEC Digital Society Working Group. So he's got a lot of experience as a standards professional, although he's peering at that ICT thing. Oh, no, you're there. Mainly in ICT. And of course, you've been prominent in SEN, Senelec and ETSI. And also, interestingly, active in a number of standards working groups on smart cities. But we're going to look at the consumer angle. We haven't talked too much about consumers. They've certainly come up in terms of choice. And they've certainly come up in terms of human rights, human-centred and data protection. That's what we heard from the Commission. So there's all of these kind of new but particularly personalised goods and services that are there. How concerned are consumers about the cybersecurity and privacy risks? We've heard there that the SMEs are perhaps not aware enough. We've heard there from Steve at the outset saying, crumbs, you need to think about what you put out there. What's your view on that from the consumer perspective?
Yeah, well, thank you, Kirsten. First of all, I'd like to thank the meeting organisers for having invited consumer interlopers into this very interesting discussion. ANEC is, for those of you who don't know, a kind of equivalent body to SBS in the sense that they're both recognised as significant in terms of Annex 3 of the standardisation regulation, and therefore we have responsibilities to ensure that particular views are taken into account in European standardisation. So ANEC is doing the consumer interests in the same way as SBS is for SMEs. I think, to be honest, a lot of the issues are going to be very different between consumers and SMEs in terms of technical standards, but I think on this issue, on the overall way in which people are reacting to the data economy, there's a great deal of commonality in the needs of consumers and the needs of SMEs, and in many senses, I suspect a lot of them are indistinguishable. And I hope, therefore, that the consumer perspective will also strike a lot of chords with SMEs. I'm going to bore you with some statistics, I suppose.
As long as you keep them short, you can bore me.
Very briefly, yes, but a lot of the data on this comes out of things like the Eurobarometer. The last Eurobarometer, which was published by the Commission in January, therefore it's pre-COVID, assessed what consumers felt about people using their data, and concerns there. Over half of consumers worried about that. About 40% very worried about doing online payments. About 30% very unusually concerned about even whether they were going to get goods if they ordered them online. And in fact, concerns about online privacy and security seem to have caused most people to change their behavior. And a third of people will not actually take up solutions, or they're concerned about it to the point where they're very reticent. And there's also, of course, great concern about cybercrime. COVID is going to reinforce some of this, but even the 2019 figures showed a kind of deterioration in the way in which people had confidence in this system. There's a lot of need for information, clearly, to people, but equally that's where the the standards approach comes in, and where we can perhaps ensure that a standardized approach to things like authentication, to how to avoid some of these difficulties can help considerably. So it's not just a technical standards issue.
And I think, you know, you there were digging down a little bit into the details, and even to the point where you said that concerns made people change their behaviour. Steve was saying, you know, users have to think about what to put out there, but there does have to be balance. I mean, we live in this world where we do expect that people play fair, that what we're doing, we know it's not the case, but we still hope it is, we still expect it. And if we get damaged in some way or another, if there is harm to us in some capacity or other, then we'd expect there to be liability, would we not? Or we would expect to be able to get recompense, or for a wrong to be put right, particularly as a consumer.
Well, yeah, but I mean, that it's obviously something that will depend on legislation. I don't think personally, and this is just a personal view, it's not a formal ANIC position or anything, that we are remotely sufficiently concerned about the way in which people's data is being treated. And the EU has done a lot in terms of stepping forward in GDPR, but the big multinationals are still getting all this data, and people are still not clear what's being done with that, and so on. So there has to be both combinations of legislation, of standards to back up that legislation, and of enforcement, which equally, of course, is of concern to the average consumer. If nothing is going to be done about these problems, then we're not going to achieve the benefits of the data society, are we?
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. And I think this issue of enforcement, it did, of course, come up on the first panel. It is something that's being looked at in the data strategy. And I think it's something that my feeling is, particularly from moderating in different sectors, that that's some expectation of the EU in terms of implementation, but enforcement. What are you going to do? It's there. It's not being adhered to. I will stop there, and I will, in fact, before I ask my sort of next questions to the panel, I just want to, it's great, thank you so very much to the audience for sending in stuff already, and quite short. So I'm going to come back to Steve, actually. There is a question for you. It was mentioned that, and you did say this, that what needs to be addressed is the problem. Don't rush to a solution, address the problem. You need to understand the data. So what do you think is the main problem for SMEs when they're dealing with cyber security?
I think there are many problems, but perhaps the biggest one is getting access to expertise at reasonable cost. This is not easy even for the best companies or the richest companies, however you want to look at it. It's acknowledged that worldwide we have a shortage of security skill sets. And I would imagine for SMEs it's extremely difficult to get the right expertise, but that's got to be the starting point. I think every SME that has a strong online presence has to have the access to a minimum amount of expertise, I would say. There's a lot of stuff online, and NISA puts a lot of stuff online itself. I hope this is helpful. Our problem in helping SMEs is not actually a very useful term in cybersecurity, because an SME could be a butcher, it could be a robotics company, it might be a fertility clinic, and imagine the different requirements of those three types of small enterprises. They are hugely different in what they're looking from security. So I think the biggest problem for SMEs is understanding what they need to know. It's actually not as great as most people think it is. The barrier to entry is not that high. But of course, you've got to have gone through the stage of learning that. And I would say a lot of what SMEs can do for themselves is simply a translation of what we think of common sense in our everyday lives. A lot of the sort of risk management we do in everyday life translates quite nicely into the online environment. For instance, it's obvious, if you go to sites which are dealing with, heavy gambling or pornography or whatever, of course you're going to have much more chance of being infected than if you're dealing with sites which are much more straightforward, open and transparent, etc. This is common sense. So the biggest problem is getting access to information. And the second problem, actually, very quickly, is achieving a sensible balance, to my mind, between risk and cost. So once you've understood what the risk is, and that's understanding the problem, you have as an SME to say, what is a reasonable cost to manage that risk? And that's also not so easy. But again, it's not rocket science. There are many people who've done it. And what ENISA tries to do is help spread this knowledge between SMEs so they learn from each other.
So it's not rocket science, it's a step-by-step approach. But what you are effectively answering, you're picking up on what Fabio said. He said, listen, most SMEs actually don't ask themselves the question in the first place. They need that awareness. Well, it's not just awareness training. You said, OK, there's a shortage of training, but the expertise. But don't be afraid, actually. A lot of that common sense can translate into a lot of that risk management, approach. I won't say common sense, that's a very Boris Johnson word with COVID-19. A lot of the risk management approach can translate into the online environment from the everyday. Just before I lose you, and I will come to the other three gentlemen, I promise I'll keep this balanced. I've read, and the EU has been talking about a new data paradigm, less data stored in data centres, more spread in a more pervasive way. So how can we ensure data security when that data is being exchanged? Because that's...
This is not so difficult. The problem doesn't lie there. We have, for instance, data exchange is normally secured by cryptographic methods. They're well tried. They're extremely good. They don't tend to be the things that fall down. Most of the problems we have are due to the human element, I would say, or the process element. So every security solution has three elements: people, process, technology. And they have to work in harmony together. And if they don't, that's where you get problems. So we have solutions for all these things, but the kind of problems that have been raised by my colleagues, and for which I have a lot of sympathy for, are more about how people are using these techniques. Are they using them or abusing them? Big companies are hiding data when they shouldn't be, and it's not for me to say whether they are or they're not. That's the problem. And that is not something that cybersecurity can do anything about. That is something about understanding what is data ownership, what is transparency, and what is reasonable use. And these are very hard questions, of course.
OK, thank you. I'm going to come to Lars, because in a very what I would say cliched Swedish way, you were so tremendously concise in your opening. So I'd like to hear from you again. And there has actually been a question come in. AI can be used for monitoring. We're talking about your particular business and what you offer in terms of lifts and elevators, and for all of those different purposes, monitoring for all of those different users and owners. AI can be used for monitoring. Some concerns have been raised about cybersecurity and AI. What are your thoughts on this?
Again, and I think Steve pointed that out as well, cybersecurity is not an issue. We have...
Just put your... do you have greater volume or you don't? Are you on top volume where you are?
Presumably not.
Oh, it would be lovely.
I don't know if I can't... I can change the volume. Do you feel you're not hearing me well enough?
Oh, you were a bit soft, yeah.
Okay, well...
that's better.
We can move the microphone here. Again, I don't think cybersecurity is an issue. We can deal with that. The issue is actually access to data. The main issue is who owns the data. If I buy something, for instance, if I buy a printer, and then later the manufacturer of the printer wants me to buy his cartridges only, and is he allowed to change the firmware in that printer so it will stop functioning if I buy third-party cartridges? That puts the finger on the issue. Who owns the data? Who is allowed to alter it afterwards? So if I buy a product, I pay for it, I presume I would control everything in that product, but that's no longer the case. When embedded data, when functionalities driven by softwares in the product, which can be updated afterwards without your knowledge or even concern, and then the resulting data from the use. who owns those? We had it from the car industry. A car during its operation generates millions of bytes of data. Who owns those? Can the owner control, restrict, or is it only for the manufacturer? And as you realized, this has much to do with the competitive landscape. The SMEs are highly disadvantaged because they do not have the power to design those systems. They are more at the back end of it, trying to maintain, repair, upgrade, or whatever they do, and are therefore totally dependent on open access to data. So, yeah, please.
And in the context, so you're less concerned, your concern is less in the cybersecurity area, it's starting at the access. And just a whiff of going back to panel one, then are you also a big proponent of standards in order to facilitate that access to the data and create a more level playing field?
Of course, without standards. I mean, let's take internet. It's the internet standards on text transfer, video transfers, audio transfers, email transfer, whatever, which has laid the framework for what we now see as the World Wide Web and all those functionalities, even this very video meeting, which is now something even my grandmother could do. Whereas 20 years ago, this was a highly specialized and very expensive technology. So yes, standards have been driving it, but standards is the mere starting point for the next question. And these questions are, in my example of the printer, these are legal. These are the issues. Who owns the data? Who can access that data? Are there any restrictions? Who can use it? And can they use it for their own business purposes? And is there a cost? Is there a delay in the data, for instance? Okay. So it can only be accessed when it's a week old.
So for you, if I'm going back to the title of this second panel, for you, that is where it could jeopardize SMEs' ability to exploit the full potential of the data economy. We've got to start right there and address some of those very difficult issues.
Of course, because in many sectors, I think elevators, lifts are the same basic logic. You have a rather limited number of new equipment manufacturers, but thousands and 10,000s of maintenance companies. Okay. It's also in most of those businesses so that you sell a product at a too low price, even a loss, in order to ensure that you can get the maintenance revenues for the future. And this, of course, drives the logic that everybody wants to be in maintenance and nobody wants to make the new equipment. And the ones who make the new equipment want them to restrict, so that only they themselves can maintain the equipment. And here data becomes the new currency.
I'm going to stop you. Okay, I'm going to stop you there just because I've got my eye on the clock and because I think you have very cogently, really genuinely very cogently made your point. I will come back to you. I'm going to come to Fabio and to John again. And Fabio, first of all, I'm going to pose a question that's come in from the audience, which is how many standards do you think are relevant concerning cybersecurity, and how can SMEs know which ones are relevant for them? Oh. You need to unmute yourself. I can't hear you. Are you there?
Yes, I am.
Ah, voila. Okay.
But the quick answer is there are too many cybersecurity standards, especially for SMEs. One SME for correctly doing their business wouldn't need much more than one single standard, possibly, to do that. Sorry for the fire guards.
Are they about to take you away somewhere?
No, hopefully not.
Okay. All right.
So the point is we don't need many standards. There are already by far too many information security standards. In the main committee I work with, which is SC27 within ISO, has got nearly 200 standards out. And they still produce more. Of course, they are not aimed to SMEs. they have to aim to all the market and to all the needs. But really, they are really too many, and they are much too few used. You are allowed to produce and put on the market products and services without any security. It's like you sell cars without any brakes, without airbags, without anything. And nobody is telling you anything on that. So this is a wider problem. Of course, it doesn't touch just SMEs, but I think that the market should be regulated in when we speak about information security and cybersecurity, especially because in these days, ever more we will be having autonomous driving vehicle in the streets. We already have autonomously controlled trains. We don't have autonomously controlled flights yet, but we will. So there are many parts of our lives that will be interested by information security and the consequences of lack of information security, and we have to definitely consider that.
So you, if I grasp correctly, you've talked there that there should be, the market should be regulated. That's what we do need. That there is just a proliferation of cybersecurity standards for SMEs, too many. If we talk about regulation now, I will come back to you, but I'm going to pass to John because it ties in with a question that's come in for John. John, when I finished, or you finished up with, legislation and standards plus enforcement, that was one of the last comments that you made. Legislation that underpinned by standards, but we need that enforcement. And somebody has come back and said, well, do you have any preferences, standards or legislation? Do you have any preferences for specific cases and why? And nice and short, please. Thank you.
Right. Well, yeah. I think it's not a question of preferences. It's a question of the two dovetailing together. One thing it was mentioned very early on in the conference was, for example, the question of design, introducing values and principles in product and service design, privacy by design. These are standards, can become standards which can help consumer choice, and they underpin legislation. We need to encourage that sort of approach. I think Europe has come quite a long way towards it. We've had now the cybersecurity legislation, which maybe we'll come on to later in this discussion. But I think, again, the fact is that the standards are needed to ensure that the legislation is effective, and they are a measure by which the enforcement can take place. The plea from our side, from the consumer side, would be to make sure that consumers' views are properly taken into account in this whole process. We've come a long way towards ensuring that with the European legislation on standards, but we have not been able to accomplish as much as we'd like. And there are indeed, as Fabio mentioned, too many activities. ANEC is faced with trying to find experts to participate in quite a number of cybersecurity bodies, in standardization terms, both in Europe and internationally. Obviously, ANEC gives preference to Europe because that's what its vocation is. But indeed, we would feel that maybe more needs to be done at European level, because that clearly is where we are with our GDPR legislation and so on. It would be better if we develop our own solutions before simply rushing off to internationalize them, with the greatest respect to those on this panel who are active in international standards. They're less likely to be useful for consumers.
And we heard about that, in fact, from Sylvia. We touched upon that in our first panel as well. So you are echoing some comments from there. I'm going to crack on because it's 15:54 and we've got about 10, 12 minutes, but I want to give you a chance to definitely talk about the Cybersecurity Act and the certification scheme in line with that. So I'm going to, ask for your two penneth. So ENISA is responsible for developing the certification scheme in line with the Cybersecurity Act. So, of course, we're talking about SMEs. How can we be sure that future certification schemes are really going to take into account their specific needs and capacities? And how are the standards going to be important in this context, Steve? Oh, you're off. I can't hear you. Oh, are you on?
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Can indeed, yeah.
Just a very brief comment on standards, because this is actually a very subtle point, but incredibly important. So I'm a great believer in standards. I think they're really important, and the certification framework will depend entirely on standards. But we get into problems when we look at things like general purpose software. Think of it, just for the sake of argument, a spreadsheet. Anyone can use a spreadsheet. You might use it at home to keep your CDs. It might be used in a nuclear power station to control a workflow process. The risks or the threats associated with those two usage patterns are enormously different. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So one of the problems we have when securing general purpose software is, what risks are we dealing with, given that these things can go into all target environments? And that turns out to be a very, very difficult problem, and probably means that we're going to have to come up with standards which are very context dependent, as I was saying at the beginning of the meeting, and adjust our standards to the target environment. So I had to say that it's absolutely critical to the understanding the standards debate. In terms of your question, the certification framework, it was really designed as being a very open, all-inclusive framework. We spend a lot of time doing this, and there are many points at which you can intervene. Within the governance structure of the certification framework, you have a group called the Stakeholders Cybersecurity Certification Group, and they are one of the most powerful bodies in the framework, and there are representatives in this group from the SME community, which is very pleasing. We wanted it to be that way. So that's one way in which you can intervene, and that list is published, I believe, on our website, so you should be able to find out who these representative organizations are. Secondly, whenever we attack a new scheme, we set up a working group. And in populating this group, we really try to make sure that we have all walks of life in that group. So typically we will have people from standards organizations, we will have industry, we will have consumer protection, we'll have privacy people. So here's a second opportunity to intervene. Of course, it's not easy, because for a scheme we may only have 20 to 30 people. It's a highly competitive process, but there will be someone in there, hopefully, or inevitably, in my opinion, who will represent the views of the SMEs. And lastly, in terms of SME, well, not lastly, actually, thirdly, in terms of SME ability to influence the process, we will go to a public consultation as part of developing these schemes, which is yet another opportunity to make your points of view known. And what is perhaps last but not least is talk to ENISA. I mean, my team, I have about 70 people, and their job is really to spend most of their time talking to our different stakeholder groups and bringing their opinions and ideas back home so that we make sure that we take account of them. So, okay, if you talk to us, somehow it will get back into the machine. I don't make any promises, but we really put a lot of importance on this multi-stakeholder approach. Okay. So I hope that gives you 4 different mechanisms for intervening in the process.
Okay, thank you. And can I just ask you, do you actually do your CDs on an Excel spreadsheet?
No, I don't use spreadsheets very often. It was just a stupid example.
I love it. No, I love it because you are so eloquent and clear. And then I love kind of slightly pulling the rug under your feet.
You should tell my wife that. She wouldn't agree.
Is she not, with those ridiculous comedy questions of mine? Okay, which obviously are not well placed on my part. Thank you very much for that. So you put those 4 different mechanisms, those 4 ways that SMEs can make sure that their needs and capacities are taken into account in future certification schemes. I just want to ask the same question, please, to Fabio, just to ensure that those future schemes under the Cybersecurity Act are going to actually be helpful for the companies that we are under discussion in today's conference. Anything to add there to what Steve, the 4 examples Steve gave?
I quite agree on the examples provided by Steve. What we think is that we have a great opportunity in our hands, and how the Cybersecurity Act is written, there it leaves the door open for wonderful outputs or worse outputs. But the way it's good, it can be used well. The one thing of which I'm most worried about for what I'm hearing in around those tables is a very big concentration on common criteria schemes, which are, I would say, the oldest kind of standardization frameworks out there among the many standards that can be applied. And they are aimed to products and they are really awful for small, medium enterprises because they are very much complex and complicated. So hopefully we will be able to use the expertise gained from those schemes and add some other things that are more modern and more suitable.
And simplify
and simple.
Yeah. Which is what we have also been emphasising in the first panel. Before I leave you, because the clock is ticking, and I just, a question that came in that I will come to you first. A question came in saying, should we not distinguish developing new cybersecurity standards which aren't necessarily useful from integrating cybersecurity aspects when designing the tech specs of connected objects?
Well, there is an old say about standards. We have 50 standards on a topic. Let's do it the 51st that is better and integrates and replaces them all. And this is how we end up with having 51 standards rather than 50. So probably this is not really the best way to do that. Anyways, we have a wonderful tool, which is SEM, which is a European standardization body. And there is the JTC 13, which is quite a recent body inside it, which is in charge of cybersecurity. Probably this is the most fruitful place to have those kind of discussion. I don't have the silver bullet on that question. Unfortunately, but I think that it has to be found there.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm coming just to John, and then I will come to Lars at the end. John, obviously I'm going to focus in now for you, my last question, on the consumer perspective and future certification schemes under the Cybersecurity Act. So what are the kinds of main issues that need to be addressed there?
Yeah, well, ANIC actually has a view that we need a bit more legislation. We're supporting strongly the certification effort and have joined the coordination group, and I think ANIC is also on the ANISA advisory group. So that's all positive, and of course we'll try to put the consumer views. At the same time, we would also support the adoption of new legislation in complementing the Cybersecurity Act to, for example, try to ensure that there's a built-in higher standard of security where consumers are particularly vulnerable. For example, critical infrastructure that's affecting individuals, health data, financial data, and so on. So it's a belt and braces, I think. The security certification schemes will help, provided they take account of consumer views, but equally they need to be to have a bit of legislative teeth behind them.
And there you gave an example. I mean, and even in certain, Steve was talking about the risks, you know, all this the general purpose approach he was talking, and then of course you were talking about areas high security where consumers, you know, where they're going to be particularly vulnerable. One citizen, a consumer, would be in healthcare, but of course if we're even looking in that area, you know, what we're looking at in terms of me going down in a schedule for an appointment is very different to the risks that I am vulnerable to in other aspects of healthcare. So it's very, very complex, even within a single sector, is it not?
Yeah, absolutely. But again, surely I would have thought the legislation can maybe distinguish, and certainly the certification scheme should be. In other words, your appointment is certainly something you're probably not going to be so sensitive about protecting. as compared with the data that the consumers is on the consumer's own medical device. The same with financial data.
Yeah.
Clearly, it's obvious, I think.
Thank you very much. I will come back to Lars. Lars, I'm going to sort of ask you a strange one, maybe to just, you heard what everybody, has said. And I wondered if, Lars, from your own experience, there's anything that you particularly wanted to add from what you'd heard or to comment on. I've heard that you are less concerned about the cybersecurity, but who is owning the data. You have a very particular view on cybersecurity and how it's used by bigger companies to restrict access. Any one other thing that you would endorse or reinforce that your peers have said in the last minute?
I think all the panelists are very, very wise and educated on cybersecurity and what can be done and not be done about it. I do not see that as a main issue, particularly not from an SME point of view. As has been pointed out, that the SMEs are lacking knowledge and expertise in a lot of areas. And standards is a nice way forward, but it also complicates things because standards might be 50 pages and quite Byzantine in its language and application. Mm-hmm. What is more required for the SME is that there will be someone to call, like an EU help desk, for be it standards or be it the legislative landscape around who knows the data of that car or that lift. Mm-hmm. Is the manufacturer allowed to restrict me from accessing it? I bought the product, I paid for it. Please give me a way to access the data. Those issues are far more important from the SME point of view. And I must say, EU is good in making rules, but it comes in patent language, it's called reduced into practice, which means that you can have a great idea, but if you can't make it happen in reality, sure, it's worth nothing. So EU also has to make sure that they get that impact in the target by allowing, in this case, since I'm speaking for the SMEs to fully and open and easily access these things. So we need a lot more hands-on people. Let's call it a help desk. Okay. I think that will be my ending comment. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, well, I am going to leave it there because I'm very conscious of time and I want to keep our audience with us right until the end because we do have the director of SBS to give some golden words of wisdom and some important information at the end. I do thank you all. I think it was extremely interesting, all of your different points of view. I was cheered to hear, okay, it's an awareness first and it's this kind of step-by-step approach. It's clear that there is a shortage of expertise. You can find it, there needs to be more, but if you can't find it, then really translate that risk management approach that you take in the everyday into the online environment. There was an emphasis there from Lars that really actually for me, it's all about the data, the access to it, the ownership to it, and Ursula von der Leyen needs to actually set up a help desk that she herself will sit on the phone, or maybe Timmermans, when he's not doing his European Green Deal, he could do that. Very interesting there from the consumer perspective, and again, just this enforcement issues, but also that the values and the privacy that we talked about at the outset need to go into the design. That's absolutely critical. And yeah, I mean, I think simplify, simplify, simplify. That's what Fabio said. It's clear. I don't think any SME watching this, and yes, who made the observation? You did, Steve. I mean, the variety between SMEs is huge, so it's not a homogeneous lump. We really, really need to think about that. But simplicity, God damn it, is key, particularly when there are costs and time involved. So thank you so very much, gentlemen. You are allowed to take your leave now and go and have a nice big glass of gin and tonic or 3 or whatever is your tipple or not. So thank you. It's been absolutely great to have them. Don't go away, ladies and gentlemen. They are going to take their leave. But we actually do have a brilliant last speaker. We are in the twilight moments. And that brilliant last speaker, well, who is that brilliant last speaker? I think we have a little bit of a break bumper now. Who will tell you who she is? So here we are, we're back, I'm here, and hopefully, yes, you can, I hope, see the lovely lady who is sitting with me. I've been almost all alone. I was joined by the gentleman from the German presidency at the start, and now I'm joined by SBS Director. Hello to you, Maitane Olabaria. So it's absolutely delightful. Instead of you sort of talking down the lens, we're going to share a little bit because it's so nice to have you here. I've got a couple of questions for you, if I may. I know you've been very much, I think, in listening mode throughout this event. So the obvious thing that I'm going to ask you, you are the specialist and not me, what particularly stood out for you? And is there anything of all of that that was either said or wasn't said that you want our audience to think about or do when they walk away from here?
Thank you, Katrina. I think for me, one of the main takings today is, without a doubt, the importance of standards in the data economy. I think we heard some very good examples in the first panel dealing with different sectors. For me, I think it was very clear during the debate, access to data is key. It's a key aspect for SMEs, and standards here have a very important role to play. We heard about interoperability. Yeah. We also heard not only about interoperability, but also about understanding the information, which is also very important. Yeah. And I think really standards are key in order to make sure that we have the technical foundations of the data economy.
And to underpin the legislation.
Exactly. That's actually another important aspect. Standards are not the answer for everything. I think it was very clear during the debate that we need some issues to be dealt with legislation, and there are other issues that need to be dealt with standardization. So both legislation and standardization have an important role to play here. Another important aspect, I think, was open standards. Yeah. This was also mentioned during the debate. I think open standards are very important both for consumers and for SMEs. We heard how too often big players sometimes use standards also as a way to actually gain a dominant position in the market. And regarding the last panel, I think an important taking there was the fact that access to data go hand in hand with privacy and cybersecurity. Mm-hmm. Both aspects are very important. And I think something that I think is right, and it was said also in the last panel, consumers and SMEs regarding the data economy have quite a few common interests as well.
And a role to play.
Exactly.
They need to think about it. They can't just depend upon a framework, a structure, a legislation. The world isn't working like that. You need to take personal responsibility.
As well. You are right. That was also an important message that we heard in the second panel. And maybe just to end, I think regarding the main conclusions of in the different panels, I think something that also came out as well was the importance of the involvement of SMEs in standardization. It's important that they are also involved in standardization. There are challenges, but they need to be involved so that we can make sure that standards don't only cater for the needs of big companies, but take into account as well SME needs.
And we heard different ways, and it was an interesting discussion going throughout the threading of what the Commission suggests, and okay, it's going to take time and interest and resources, and will SMEs kind of invest in that, but at the same time we heard from the professor saying, well, yeah, but also actually things need to be simpler and it needs to be communicated the ways that they can get involved. So there seems to be some viewpoints on both sides there, and that marriage of...
And I think something also interesting from the discussion was indeed that sometimes we have standards. The issue is how you you can actually find the right information and what are the right standards that you need to use.
It's a jungle out there.
Yeah.
So we heard at the beginning from the President, she said, as in so many sectors, there are challenges and there are opportunities. I'm actually going to ask you not to be negative because you're going to end with a very positive message, but where do you see the biggest challenge or pain point going forwards?
Regarding the biggest challenges, you referred to the president, and I want to actually come back to her words at the opening speech. She mentioned that the main challenge is to make the data economy work for all. And I think that's indeed the main challenge. It needs to work for consumers, for small companies, and for big companies. In order to do that, we already discussed, we need to make sure that we strike a balance between legislation, standards, innovation, and we also, I heard at the beginning, also European values as well. This is something that we also heard in the opening session.
And on the back end, enforcement. On the front
As
end,
well.
European values, on the back end, but that came up quite a lot. Yeah,
exactly, as well. Because indeed, if you have legislation, you also need to enforce it. Or if you have some issues that need to be addressed, they need to be enforced as well. I agree with you. Regarding this, I think I'm coming back to the same issue. I think involvement of SMEs in standardization is key. We also heard the Commission is going to work in a European standardization strategy. So this is also an important element that needs to be reflected in that strategy. And we know, and I think we heard it as well during the day, there are many challenges for SMEs regarding, first of all, awareness, lack of awareness, as you were mentioning as well, and also lack of resources. That's why I think in this standardization strategy it's also important that we stress the need to take into account and to use the networks of SMEs that are already there, and also that we provide, as someone said, incentives or funding to be involved.
Yeah, and you have a very specific role. I mean, do you want to just underline what is your role in helping to achieve, the needs of SMEs being met, to make sure that their voice is heard? Do you want to underline what SBS's role is?
Yeah, so I think it's what I said before. It's important to get SMEs involved. In SBS, we are basically there to represent SMEs in standardization through our members, which are national and European SME organizations. We represent 12 million SMEs. And we do this to support SMEs to get involved in many ways. So we do this by appointing experts to standardization committees, by providing training as well, by disseminating information regarding standardization developments. And regarding the data economy, for example, we have published very recently as well a position paper where we are highlighting the main issues that need to be taken into account following the publication of the data strategy from an SME perspective. And I think these elements are very much the elements that also came up today during the discussion. And finally, there is a point that I wanted to mention. We have also been working from a couple of years already on an SME compatibility test. SMEs cannot be in every single committee, but this test is there to provide a tool for SMEs when we are developing a standard to actually check the standard against SME requirements. So it's a very important tool that we will be launching next week, and we really hope that it will help to take into account much better the interest of SMEs in standardization.
So launching next week. So
yes.
Literally news hot off the press. Thank you so very much. I am so conscious of timing to keep our good people with us till the very end. Any last words? Have you said everything you wanted to say?
Well, I wanted to thank you very much for moderating this event. I think we had very interesting discussions. I also want to thank all the speakers for contributing to this event and making it a success. And also to the audience that was online and bear with us until the end. And finally, I also, last but not least, I also wanted to thank the SBS team and especially Tessa Delville for the great work in putting together this event.
Thank you so much. You preempt what I'm going to say, so thank you. It's a pleasure, really, to have you literally with me at the end. It makes such a difference for all of the wizardry and genius, and God knows we need it through, can't even say needed it through COVID-19. We still need it, all of these digital platforms and how we have all moved forward. it doesn't beat this, you being next to me here. That's great. It has demanded a huge amount of work. I echo the thanks to the team. Herculean efforts. Yes, Tessa Delville, she's been absolutely tremendous. She hasn't slept for, I don't know, 7 months? Who knows? But thank you so much to that brilliant team. Thanks to all of those fabulous guests. You never have time to download but a smidgen of the content of your considerable brains, but it's always really an immense privilege to sit and talk to all of these sectoral experts. Thanks, big thanks to the technical team. You can't see them running around in the background here with me at the Square, for keeping us all on screen and for keeping us all audible. And of course, huge thanks to the interpreters. God knows this is a hell of a topic, certainly to moderate, so goodness knows what it is like for those interpreters to do the job that they do. Of course, if you enjoyed watching, of course, get in touch with SBS. You found out all about it, but do tweet some eloquent gems, #standards4SMEs, and you can also get chatty on LinkedIn. Just look for SBS and you can share your thoughts there. I wish you all much rigour and much success in your ongoing endeavours. There's so much going on in this domain. Good luck and almost good evening from me here, Katrina Sichel, live in Brussels. Perhaps I'll see you again.